no matter how evil, no matter how gross the terms of your contract, you will inevitably hear the words, it's just standard. If something is in your contract that you really don't like, or that you feel like could be ruinous for you financially or for your future, you can bring it up and they'll say, oh, it's just standard. And that should not weigh on your opinion of the terms one iota. It shouldn't have any bearing on how you feel about what these terms mean.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast, brought to you by Entrepreneur.io.
What's up, Indies? Welcome back to the Creative Juice podcast. This is episode 342, and we're going to be kicking off this episode with something a little different. We're going to talk music business. We're going to talk negotiation, deal making, contracts, and go a little bit off the beaten path of our normal discussions around music marketing to talk about career building skills and building partnerships and building teams and why it's important to have your ducks in a row as you work to do that in your career. Something a little bit different. I'm your host, Jack McCarthy. With me, as always, is Circa. Cirque, what's up, dude?
Not a whole lot, dude. Very excited for this convo. I got a lot to say.
I'm excited about this too, man, because it's not talked about a lot. I think you and I have different vantage points that we want to bring to this discussion about contracts and negotiation and where all of those things apply. And I kind of want to kick off by saying a lot of my experience with negotiating in the music industry comes from the B2B services angle, right? It's a lot of sales conversations, negotiations and sales conversations with artists, with managers, with labels and label people and teams about services, specifically about our services. And so a lot of the discussion points that I came to the table today to talk about relate to negotiating in conversation, which isn't always the most common when it comes to artists making deals, but I think that there's some relevant points that I want to bring up. And I know that you have a slightly different vantage point that you want to come at this conversation about. And I'd love to kick off about the difference between the two of them.
Yeah. So my experience, first of all, one of the only classes that I really took an interest in, there's like 2 or 3 in college, was contract law and negotiations, taught by this awesome dude, God rest his soul, DJ Zadonek. And he really imbued in me this interest, this fervor for law. I had already had some interest in law in that I was one of very few people growing up who could like understand legalese. Like, dude, I had this like natural proficiency for English language. English language is this syntax that has like rules. And so when I read legalese, it made a lot more sense to me than it seemed to other people, because it's like math told through language almost. And so I took a very keen interest in that class. I also was predisposed to enjoy it because of all the books I had read growing up about the music industry and how like most of the tragedy that befalls artists is because they signed a bad contract and they didn't know how to read their contract. So I was like, wow, all the evil of this industry is encapsulated in these contracts. And that really piqued my interest in them. And so I actually applied myself in that class a lot. And I studied all the pitfalls of common music industry contracts. I would say a healthy majority, over 95%, of the disputes in the music industry, the revenue that's generated in the music industry, the contacts that are made, the things that are discussed in the music industry, all fall back to some contract. So it's very B2B, and almost all of the revenue gets generated by contractual agreement. And even the laws that instantiate our property in this industry are based on legal contracts or legal agreements. So it's a very litigious industry. And so my vantage point has always been that aspect of it, my interest in it, but also I was able to apply that knowledge and that interest later on. So after college, I was managing a recording studio where I had literally hundreds of artist friends who recorded there or hung out there. And some of them would end up in situations where they're signing a management deal, or they're being signed to a label, or they're being represented by some other. Almost every relationship you could get into in the music industry begins and ends with a contract. So in my history, I've read a great deal of music industry paper, as it's called. And a lot of times it's shit paper. I mean, I would say if I were to get a contract from a friend and read it and not find anything wrong with it, I would fall out of my chair. That's how unlikely it is. It just doesn't happen. It's almost always something that is just like egregious and bad and that they need to negotiate out or not sign. And so that's kind of my vantage point, is dealing with the contract law portion of it. And there's really not so much negotiation in the sense that it's not as if the artist has like a few deal points they're trying to negotiate for. It's moreover that we read the contract and we're like, we can't sign this because of this. We literally can't sign it. So we're not negotiating so much as saying like, if this doesn't change, we can't sign it. You know? So yeah, definitely a way different vantage point than like, you know, a sales conversation where you're negotiating on price or you're negotiating on term. You're not so much like dealing with absolute non-starters as much.
Yeah, for sure. When I came up with the idea to bring this topic to the show, my brain immediately went to like, Circa and I are going to have totally different vantage points that intersect with each other in different ways, depending on who you're talking to and the type of deal that you're discussing. I say this to say, like, we're not just talking about record deals for the purpose of this episode. We could be talking about management deals. We could be talking about deals with service providers. Really, anything you can imagine, we could apply the points that we're going to discuss here today to that. I love what you said about the non-starter points of contracts, because really my vantage point of negotiation and conversation, you know, like you and I might have if we were trying to strike up a partnership of some kind or bring a deal to the table for Indepreneur or build a joint venture or even just bring on agency clients like we do every single day. Those kinds of negotiations, while they are powerful, they only matter to the degree that after the fact, a contract comes through that reflects the conversation and the negotiation. And I think that that's a helpful sort of underlining point to make here before we talk about either of those, is that anything that I say on this episode about negotiating and negotiation tactics and the things that you should keep in mind, none of it matters until you see the words on paper and you can understand them.
Yeah. And I think like it would be useful to kind of, you know, I cannot teach you all of the pitfalls of a standard music industry contract, because there's management agreements, there's booking agreements, there's record label deals, there's publishing agreements. There's so many different types. There's co-producing production agreements, which are like these new form of management agreements where they're supposed to like package you and get you a deal. There's so many different types of agreements, and all of them have their own little things you really have to look out for. So I can't probably go over all those in a single episode, but hopefully I can impart with you some general maxims that will help you navigate when you end up looking at a contract in your music career.
For sure. Yeah. Well, let's start there. Let's unpack some contract structure, start there, and then we can talk about landmines that you might want to be paying attention to, generally speaking, from like a 30,000 foot view. And then I'd love to talk about just ways to go into a deal making process, things to be keeping in mind for yourself as an artist, and how to handle conversations around deals and contracts, and what might be said in a meeting versus what you might look for on paper.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Sweet. Let's do it. Let's kick off with landmines, because you've overseen a number of friends and clients and even team members contracts, as have I, but you've really gotten into the weeds with like the legalese and looking things over. Whereas I'm often just looking at like the, you know, the general points and being like, yeah, this is just bad. Like, don't bother. You've often been like, this is bad and here's why, and here's the specific words. So maybe we kick off with talking about contract structure and some of those landmines that you've seen that have been like most egregious.
Yeah. So I would say like, before actually talking about language that's in a contract, in a lot of cases that I've seen, when you get into a scenario where you're talking to a record label, less so management deals, but still publishing deals, and then especially production agreements, which are these pseudo management agreements where they're saying, I'm going to manage you, quote unquote, but I'm going to leverage my own expenses to package you, get you prepared, and then walk you into a record deal. And then I get a percentage of that deal. So my whole goal is to really package you in a production agreement. With these agreements, if you end up in these scenarios, there's a couple of things you're going to encounter before you even get to the language that's in the contract. So one is that you're going to be told by everyone to get an entertainment lawyer. In a lot of cases I've seen, your counterparty in the negotiation, the person you're signing the deal with, is going to recommend you do it as well. And I've seen a lot of cases where they'll actually recommend a lawyer for you. And I can't begin to tell you how legally dicey that is. It's so, there's no other industry in the world where they would ever do this. And it's because of how much liability you take on by having anything to do with your counterparty's legal arrangements. Okay. Is so dicey to say, hey, I know a lawyer. I'll refer you to that lawyer, because what could happen is you could then sue them saying, hey, you set me up with a hack lawyer, or you set me up with a lawyer who is more favorable to you, or who is friends with you. Okay. So there's a huge conflict of interest, but it's almost standard practice in the music industry for them to gently recommend a lawyer, or even, and I've seen this, like I've experienced this.
So have I.
Get you a lawyer. Your counterparty will hire a lawyer on your behalf. And even if you were to go source your own entertainment attorney, I've found that these entertainment attorneys are so numb to egregious, unfair, unjust terms that they will completely ignore them. They'll look them over. But if it falls in line with like other shit they've seen, they'll just like not say anything about it.
It's like, oh, there's been precedence for this, so I'm okay with it.
There's precedent, right? Yeah. So if you really don't want to be screwed, but the precedent is that, yeah, you're going to get screwed, they just won't even mention, hey, this is going to screw you. They don't even talk about it. So what I would really hope for you is that, hey, yes, maybe get an entertainment attorney, sure, but use ChatGPT, use Google, and go over every line of your contract yourself until you understand it. If you don't understand it, ask ChatGPT what it means. Because like, if you don't understand it, there's going to be something in there that your entertainment attorney just ignores because it's standard. And that brings me to the second point I want to make, which is that no matter how evil, no matter how gross the terms of your contract, you will inevitably hear the words, it's just standard. If something is in your contract that you really don't like, or that you feel like could be ruinous for you financially or for your future, you can bring it up and they'll say, oh, it's just standard. A lot of times the counterparty that you're speaking with, like you're talking to a manager and he gets his legal team to send you over a contract. He doesn't know what's in it. Okay. But what he will say about it is that it's standard. We send it to everyone. It's okay. This is a standard contract. And that should not weigh on your opinion of the terms one iota. It shouldn't have any bearing on how you feel about what these terms mean. Do not let the social pressure of a bunch of other idiots sign this to mean that you should be an idiot and sign this. It's just a bad idea. So you will get recommended to get an entertainment attorney, but that does not by any means safeguard you from horrendous outcomes. You can totally get screwed.
And this is true across industries too. That's a really good point that you bring up, Cirque. I've gotten contracts for a variety of things, vendor agreements, stuff like that, where it's like, oh, we just sent over our standard vendor contract. And then you look at it and it's like, this is standard. People sign this. This is garbage. Like I would never sign something like this. So yeah, that definitely transcends industries, but is something to look out for.
Yeah. If it's a standard that you regularly screw other people who are in my position, that doesn't make me feel any more comfortable. It may sound like I'm being adversarial, but like in almost any negotiation that my friends have gotten into in the music industry, it's adversarial. if they want to protect their interests, if they want to have a thriving career far into the future, they have to be an adversary to their counterparty, because their counterparty will act as if they should just be lucky to sign this. They should just be lucky to sign away their whole life for pennies. You kind of have to adopt that very apprehensive, defensive posture, because there's going to be tons of landmines. Your entertainment attorney may well ignore them. And if you bring them up, they will tell you that you're being a baby, and that is just standard.
So I want to expand upon this a little bit before we continue talking about contracts and landmines and contract structure, because what you just said there, Circa, is a really good point about the mindset that you need to adopt going into deal making. And I think a lot of artists struggle with this, is knowing that if you're going into a deal, that you have value that you're bringing to the table, and you need to know what that is and be confident and believe in it. And that might sound a little woo-woo, but I mean it even in terms of just knowing your numbers. Here, for example, I was talking with one of our artist clients at IndieX 2 weeks ago. I was talking with their manager, and he reached out to me to ask what their email list size was as of that date. He was asking that because they were negotiating a deal, and they knew that they were bringing value to the deal in terms of his email list size and the number of subscribers and customers that they had. He was asking me that for a very specific purpose, and told me that 2 days later in a meeting. We were we were in the middle of a negotiation and a deal, and I know that our email list is valuable. And so I wanted to make sure I knew to the smallest number what we were looking at. So that's just an example of, like, you need to know your numbers. You need to know what you're bringing to the table. Otherwise, you are just kind of being treated as like the lucky person that's getting presented a deal, like it's some kind of favor that's being done to you. And that's just not the case. So you need to go into every deal that you make, every opportunity that comes your way, every chance for a partnership that comes up in your career. You need to know what you're bringing to the table, and then be confident in it and stand by it.
You also need to be aware. I would say it's probably safer for you, and generally, like, you will come out on top more often if you generally presume that when you're getting into a territory where you might sign a deal with an entity, especially like not a person, but an entity, like a corporation, you should generally presume, one, you won't like the deal or it won't be good for you. And two, you should not take it, and you shouldn't even negotiate. You should just say no. And that what that presumes is that you can say no. And that should always be the case. It should always be the case that you are not so emotionally invested in signing a deal with a record label or a manager or a publisher that you can't say no. I would say you want to be positioned towards saying no, because chances are, let me explain that, like record deals, right? There is a bottom tier of record deals. If you cross a certain threshold, they will just send you a deal. It'll be a terrible deal. If you're at the very bottom of the threshold, just above the threshold, they will send you an awful deal with almost no advance. And the reason they're doing that is because the record industry is very used to the practice of buying insurance. There is no sweat off their back to sign a deal with someone who pokes their head above the threshold if they can get them to sign it, because they don't really care how terrible it is and they're not going to change it. But if they can get you to sign it, then they have insurance against you getting bigger. Now, if you get bigger, they already have the deal. So they will just lob paper if you're above a certain threshold. And generally what they're trying to do is they're trying to buy that insurance at the lowest cost they can. So the higher above the threshold you go, the more they feel they will have to give you something like an advance, which is really just a terrible loan. It's not any, never look at an advance as like, this is what I'm getting. An advance is not consideration. It is a very high interest loan. So in contract law, consideration is what you get out of it. So your consideration is what you're giving them, and their consideration is what they're giving you. An advance is not consideration. And artists get this wrong 99.99999% of the time. They think an advance is their consideration. It's what they get, but it's just a loan. So you're not actually getting anything. You have to pay that money back. And in a lot of cases, they could, if they wanted to, pursue that money from your personal finances if your career went bust. So there is no consideration in advances. And the further you get above that threshold, they're going to raise the advance to see how cheaply they can purchase the insurance. And by purchase, I really mean rent, because they're going to get that money back. So you need to be able to walk away, because this isn't just your one chance to get a deal. This is them lobbing you an attempt at buying the insurance of you getting bigger. They want to be protected from you getting bigger and them not having you on the hook. And they will attempt, but it's going to be a terrible attempt. And all you have to do is just not be stupid enough to say, great, let's sign. And a lot of the time, what's going to happen? So you kind of have to adopt the posture of expecting yourself not to sign. And a lot of times when artists get into these situations where like a record label is sending me a contract, I'm excited. I think my moment has finally arrived, and I'm very much postured towards signing. I just am trying to, do a final check to make sure it's not going to ruin me for life. That's more often what I see with artists than them saying, here's this paper, if it's good, maybe we'll talk to them and see if we want to do a deal. They're not casual about it. Like all of their emotions and their hopes and dreams are riding on signing this contract. And I have to talk them down like, we're not signing this contract, dude.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. And it's actually really interesting that, like, as an outsider to those discussions, because usually it's friends or team members, sometimes clients. So that's not as much of an outsider perspective as it's like, slightly on the edge of outside, I guess. It's crazy. And it's always struck me how unemotional I am about it compared to the person who's being handed the paper. And I've always found that to be really interesting. Cause like, me, I'm a pretty emotional guy. Like I have charisma and I get excited about stuff and I want to talk about things and ideas and I want to look at things and pick them apart. But it is pretty crazy how unemotional I found myself in the face of looking at other people's contracts and just being like, nah, I don't, this is a waste of your time. Just throw it away. Like, I've said those words, just throw it away, more often than I thought that I probably would have if you had asked me to talk about something like this 10 or 15 years ago. And I want to touch on the topic of no real quick here, because this goes further than contracts as well and comes into play when it does come to negotiation and deals that you are negotiating. Holding the power of no is so important, because it can get you what you want more often than you think, rather than coming from a place of like, well, like I can't really do that and I need you to change XYZ things about what was just presented to me. Sometimes just saying no, a lot of times just saying no is enough to make your counterparty do the thing that you wanted. I have an example of this personally, actually. We were working on a deal a number of months ago, and I had presented terms to the person that we were going to be working with. And they were like, do you think you can shift the percentages in a certain direction for us because we need XYZ things? And I thought about it, gave it a night, and I was like, you know what? No, like that just doesn't make sense for us. And so I was like, no, like I don't think we can do that. That was all I said. And the next day they were like, okay, cool, contract signed.
Yeah, I would say that what no says when you say it to a counterparty, it says, what you just presented me is so unattractive that I'm not even really interested in going back and forth over terms. It's so off base that I'm not we can't even begin. And that forces them to either say, all right, it's not worth it for me, or to say, whoa, they didn't have the reaction that everyone has. Why? Are they smarter? Do they have something that I don't know they have? It makes them everything is on the table once you say no. That's really the beginning of the negotiation in a lot of cases.
Right.
It opens the door. Yeah.
The red zone begins there. It begins at no. And this is true in sales just as much as it is in negotiation.
Yeah. It's also the case that look, I've been in contract negotiations on behalf of friends where we have gone back and forth with them. We've pointed out, hey, everything about your paper stinks and it's nothing like what you said in the meeting. So you'll be dealing with someone who's schmoozing you. They're saying all the right things in a meeting, but then they send you paper that says literally the opposite of what they just said in the meeting. And if you point that out, they'll fix one thing, send it back, fix one thing, send it back, and really not address the overall issue of this is gross what you just sent me. And so the only way to communicate that is to flatly say no. And then again, like you have to be kind of unmotivated by the carrot they're dangling in front of you, because otherwise they're going to say like, well, it seems like you might not want to really do this, or it seems like, you're not that excited to do this. Maybe we should come back to this another time. You can't jump at that. You can't be like, oh, no, we'll do, blah, 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 blah. You can't do that. You have to be like, cool, let's not do it. That's when you actually are going to hold any power, is if you can walk away and you have no bones about it. So yeah, getting into any kind of contract negotiation or just contract signing in the music industry, you have to adopt that position of, I generally expect this paper to be terrible. I generally expect it'll be so terrible that I don't even want to sign, and I'm okay with not signing. And allow yourself to be pleasantly surprised that that's not the case.
Yeah, 100%. And just like saying no retains your power, the ability to walk away. Something else that I wanted to mention here when it comes to negotiation and just putting out there what it is you're really after is, don't be afraid to come into a negotiation conversation and say what you want and then shut up. That's a sales skill, is like give the price and then shut up. You need to be able to do that when you're working partnerships and deals. You need to be able to say the thing that you want and then don't justify it. Don't jump through all sorts of mental hoops for the person and be performative. Just say what it is you want and then see what happens. Let the person react. You don't need to give all the reasons for what you're asking for. Let the questioning come after the fact.
Yeah. And I would say that also, kind of when you get into the mode of like, let's say you're in a negotiation, someone's interested in signing you to some contract. They present you said contract, and now you're in the position of having to understand the contract. So you're reading through it. You're trying to understand all the terms. It's important that you project out what could happen.
Yeah.
You want to take a worst case scenario approach. And this is what I do every time I look over a friend's contract, is I say, based on this arrangement, what are some nightmare things that they could do? And literally for every term, I'm doing that. And that's where all the bodies are buried. In addition to being buried in, like, if you see a really dense paragraph where there's like 80 prepositions before they actually begin describing what's going on, there's bodies in there. Okay. Yeah. You have to understand it, because they literally will hide stuff in like these very dense, difficult to understand portions of the contract. But just to say that all the worst things that can happen and do happen are because of some unforeseen circumstance that's only possible because of the language in the contract. So like recently I was looking over a friend's sync licensing agreement, and I was going through it, and I realized that they had the permission to create derivative works. So if my friend submitted a song to them to be represented by them for sync, they could take that song and create a derivative preparation of it, which has different terms, which means that technically any song he submits to them, they could then like modify it slightly and then pay him less money on every song. Every song he submits, they could do that. So really, he wasn't signing this agreement for these terms.
It's a disgusting agreement.
And, I mean, they were operating in good faith. Like, I don't think they actually meant to do that. It just created a scenario where they could.
Yeah.
So he thinks he's signing for these terms because that's like the headline banner terms of the agreement. But there's these other, like, here are terms that apply in this scenario, but they could make the scenario they're in that scenario in every case. And so that's what I'm looking out for. I'm looking out for what could they do? If this all went really poorly, what's the worst that could happen? And that's generally how you want to look over your paper. So yeah, what have we gone over so far? Get an entertainment attorney, yes, but also like that doesn't matter if you're not going to understand your own contract, because they will not tell you things that you would find personally offensive. Read your own contracts. Adopt a position of no, and I think this is crap paper, and allow yourself to be pleasantly surprised. And then when you're reading over the contract, if it's incredibly difficult to understand, that's where you should spend all your time, because that's where the worst stuff is buried. And then once you do understand all the terms, look for those areas where something's a little less rigidly defined, or it creates some scenario where something really bad could happen. You want to sort of stress test all the terms. What happens if this? What if they do this? What if they do that? Until you really feel as if, nothing that terrible can happen. And then again, I would say a majority of the time, what I'm doing when I'm helping friends with contracts, I'm rewriting the language. So I'm taking it, I'm saying, I don't like this because of what it could create. How could I write this? Because I guess I'll mention, in that scenario, I know what they're trying to protect themselves against. I know why they're asking for this derivative works clause, because they have a nightmare scenario that they're trying to prevent. And it can really help to understand, why are they putting this here? What do they want? And how could I write this in a way that gives them that, but protects me from this worst case? And that's what I'm doing. I'm looking for those nightmare scenarios, understanding what they want and why they worded this so poorly, because they clearly want something to be able to happen, and then re-engineering it so that I can't be screwed either. And that's kind of like the art of looking over music industry paper. Now, in a lot of cases, you will end up with paper that you can't do that to, because it's just so off base that like it's useless to begin pointing out things wrong with it. Everything's wrong with it. And that's usually when you're dealing with people who are like less than reputable. And these can be like CEOs of record labels. Like, don't get it twisted.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think some of our listeners might be overwhelmed by what we've been talking about so far. Others might actually be a little boosted up by it, because I know if you're anything like me, I mean, Sir can attest to this for sure. Like, I am a very cautious guy. When things come around my way, I'm always kind of picking apart and being like, well, what if this, or what if that? Even today, we were talking about something, inside of the indie CRM, and we were going over a problem, and we were kind of going back and forth with each other of like, well, we need to fix it because this. Maybe we don't, but what if we do? And that's definitely my personality. And so when contracts and deals have come my way, I'm definitely more predisposed to be the type of person to immediately go to the nightmare scenario wonderings. And, for what it's worth, for my mental health, it's not always great, but it has really helped me out in business to be that way, because it puts you in a position of wanting to protect yourself. So maybe you're like me and you think that way, or maybe you're not and you don't naturally have that predisposition and you have to kind of adopt it a little bit. But I hope that there's some of you out there that at least feel a little bit heartened by that, to know that like, oh, my worrywart personality is going to come in handy here.
Yeah. Now that you have LLMs, now that you have large language models, ChatGPT, Claude, Google, whatever theirs is, Gemini, these LLMs have read over so much contract. Okay. So much of their training data is contract law. And so it's really helpful to have these tools, because you do not have to learn legalese to fully decompose a contract that you get. So you shouldn't be intimidated by what I'm asking you to do, because the last time I've had to hand review these, and it can take like an hour or two every time I've done it. But the most recent one, the sync contract, I just gave it to ChatGPT, and I said, hey, what are all of the potential nightmare scenarios that the terms of this contract could enable, for the artist? What are some things that like could potentially go wrong? It itemized for me what the things wrong were. It then gave me the exact reason that they could end up in that scenario, and like what the nightmare scenario is. And then it gave me language that safeguards me against it. Okay. So it took care of like 80% of my job for me. Not job. I'm not paid to do this. I just do it for my friends, but, but yeah, it took care of a lot of that work for me. And so, yeah, I don't want you to be too intimidated just because it's totally doable now. You can totally have an LLM look through it. And I'm actually looking through my chat histories in Claude and in ChatGPT to see if I can find the prompt that I gave it and what it returned. But yeah, just to say that like, you don't have to take a contract law negotiations course for a semester to get all this stuff.
For sure. Yeah, man, we touched on so much here today, and I feel like there's a lot more to say. So maybe we do another episode on this sometimes, because there's so many stories I actually would love to hear stories from y'all. If, as we send this episode out, shoot us an email back when you get the podcast email about the episode. We'd love to hear your war stories about nightmare contracts if you have some, or great contracts if you have some. We'd certainly love to hear about it. Maybe we can anonymize them and pick some ideas apart on the show.
I'd love to. Or if you've been sent some paper, by all means, submit it to us. I would love to go over it, on an episode just to show what the process is.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. This was super fun, Cirque. I feel like we hit a nice stride between legalese and contract law, and also a little bit of negotiation and just mindset of going into negotiation. I was going to bring up, and maybe this is a nice closing off point, a helpful negotiation tactic that is useful to use. And it's not always going to be able to be used in these circumstances where you're going back and forth with contracts. Like Cirque was saying, you can have a negotiating conversation with someone who is sweet talking you the whole time and saying all the right things, but then the paper comes back and it's the exact opposite. So not everything that we talked about when it comes to negotiation applies here, but something that I did want to mention that is useful to think about both externally, how you communicate it to your counterparty, and also internally, which is a little different than the sort of tactic itself, is asking the question, how am I supposed to do that? How am I supposed to do this? It's a question that comes up when you're presented with terms of a service or paying for something or a deal. And it's not an antagonistic question. It's truly to be like, hey, explain to me how I'm supposed to do this. Now, in the context of negotiating a contract where you might not be having a conversation like we're having right now, a negotiation conversation, you might also want to ask yourself, how am I supposed to do this? And think about what the other party might say to you. Envision that. And that can help you get into the head of why terms might be presented the way that they are. It also might allow you to think about those nightmare scenarios or research into those nightmare scenarios. And so that's, I think, a helpful tactic to consider, and also something to certainly take into negotiations if you're having actual conversations.
Yeah. I think as a final note, I'll say that contracts are not law. They are a legal basis, meaning if something is violated in your contract by your counterparty, you then have to sue them. And so really what this process is about is making it very simple for you to present your argument in court if you have to sue them, because you do not have as much resources as a record label. So you want to make it very hard for their lawyers to argue against the language. So just remember that. Remember that, hey, I just need to protect myself in all scenarios, because if it comes to a case where I have to argue this in court, I don't want to have to go over a bunch of meeting notes and, go back and forth and read this text message out loud. I just want to say, yep, it says here this, and they did this. It's clearly against it, and it's easy for you. So just set your future self up when you're negotiating a contract.
That's great advice. I hope you guys dig this. I hope it was helpful, and maybe we'll do more episodes like this in the future. But until then, we'll see you guys next time on Creative Juice. Peace out, Indies. East Coast.